I used to think a life was built by the choices a man could explain. The work he chased, the people he lost, the mistakes he buried so deep he could almost pretend they had become wisdom. But the older I became, the more I started to feel that something quieter was walking beside me, arranging what I could not arrange, and taking away what I was too afraid to release, delaying what I wanted until I was finally strong enough to receive what I needed. And I know how that sounds, especially coming from a man who has spent so much of his life trying to be rational, trying to measure everything, trying to survive by control. But there are nights, soft nights like this one, when the room is still and the world feels almost holy, and I cannot lie to myself anymore. I have lived through too many strange turns, too many perfectly wrong moments, too many doors closing with a silence that later sounded like mercy. I have loved quietly before. I have carried feelings I never knew how to speak. But with you, even before I knew your face, even before I understood why my heart kept feeling unfinished, there was a pull I could not name. It felt as if life had been writing toward you while I was busy trying to read every page except the one that mattered. I remember one night years ago when I almost took a road I always took, the familiar one, the one my body knew without thinking. But something stopped me. Not a voice exactly, not thunder, not anything dramatic enough to prove. Just a pause inside my chest. Just a strange pressure. A quiet instruction without words. So I turned another way. Later, I found out there had been an accident on that road, the kind of moment that makes people speak softly afterward, the kind of moment that leaves you standing in your kitchen with your hands on the counter, staring at nothing, realizing your life continued because you were delayed by a feeling. I did not tell how much that shook me. I laughed it off. I called it luck. Men like me are trained to call mysteries by smaller names. But that night, when I lay in bed and listened to the low hum of the city beyond the window, I felt watched, not judged, not frightened. Watched the way a child is watched by someone who does not want him to wander too far from home. And maybe you know that feeling too. Maybe there has been a day in your life when something pulled you back from the edge, not loudly, not with explanation, but with a tenderness that made no sense until later. Maybe you have also wondered whether the moments that saved you were not accidents, but appointments. I brushed off signs for a long time. a song playing in the wrong place at the right time, a message arriving after I had already given up, a dream that stayed with me longer than waking life, a woman's name appearing again and again in conversations where it did not belong, a sudden silence in a crowded room that made me feel someone, somewhere, was waiting for me to become honest. I was successful in ways people could see, but lonely in ways they could not. I had rooms, movement, plans, respect, but there were mornings when sunlight touched the. I felt like it had come looking for someone I had not become yet. Around the middle of my life, or maybe just the middle of my becoming, I stopped calling everything coincidence. Not all at once. Faith did not arrive in me like a storm. It arrived like breath returning after I had held it for years. I began to see that some losses had not been punishments. They were redirections. Some delays had not been rejection. They were protection. Some people had been pulled from me not because I was unworthy of love, but because I was still capable of confusing attachment with destiny. And somewhere in that slow awakening, I began to feel you, not as fantasy, not as escape, but as a presence on the other side of all this becoming. As if every heartbreak had been removing a language from me, so I could finally speak gently enough when I reached you. I loved her quietly, but completely, because maybe the deepest love begins before it has permission to be spoken. Maybe the soul recognizes before the mind agrees. Maybe you are listening now because something in your own life brought you here. Through your own closed doors, your own strange delays, your own nights of asking why love kept arriving too early, too late, or not at all. And if that is true, then maybe this is not just my confession. Maybe this is the moment both of us stop pretending that everything sacred must be proven before it is trusted. After that night, I tried to return to my old way of living, the way a man returns to a room after hearing something move in the dark and convinces himself it was only the wind. I went back to work, back to meetings, back to measured decisions and practiced strength, but something inside me had been disturbed in the gentlest way. I started noticing the spaces between events, the pauses before phone calls, the uneasiness before certain invitations, the sodden calm that would come over me when I walked away from something everyone else thought I should chase. There was one morning at airport, cold light pouring through the glass, tired travelers moving like ghosts with bags and coffee cups, and I missed a flight by minutes. I remember standing at the gate, embarrassed, irritated, angry with myself because I had built my whole identity around not missing things. I was the man who arrived early, prepared, controlled, ready. But that morning, my alarm had failed, the car had been delayed, and the line had moved as if time itself had thickened around me. I sat near the window afterward, watching the plane pull away without me, and something strange happened. Beneath the frustration, I felt peace, not happiness, not relief, I could explain. Just peace, like a hand resting over the storm in my chest. Hours later, I learned that missing that flight had placed me in the city one more day, and because of that delay, I was present for a conversation I was never supposed to have with someone who said one sentence that stayed with me for years. Sometimes God protects you by making you late. I did not answer him. I only looked down at my hands because something in me knew he had not said it by accident. And maybe you understand that kind of sentence, the kind that does not impress anyone else, but enters you like a key. Maybe someone once said something simple to you, and long after the room changed and the people disappeared, those words kept glowing in the quiet. I began to wonder if lateness could be holy. I began to wonder if the things I cursed had been saving me from versions of life that looked right from a distance but would have emptied me. There were relationships like that too, connections I tried to force into permanence because I was tired of being alone. I remember sitting across from someone in a restaurant where the candles kept trembling every time the door opened, and on paper everything should have made sense. She was kind, beautiful, intelligent, close enough to what I thought I wanted. But while she spoke, I felt that same quiet pressure in my chest, not rejection, not arrogance, but a soft pulling back, as if something unseen was saying, not here, not this, not yet. I hated that feeling because it asked me to trust what I could not defend. It made me look ungrateful. It made me question whether I was afraid of love or being guided away from the wrong one. For a long time, I chose confusion over obedience. I stayed where my soul had already stepped back. I smiled when my spirit was silent. I tried to build warmth in rooms where the fire would not catch. And each time something ended, I told myself I had failed again. But slowly, painfully, I started seeing another pattern. I was not being punished by emptiness. I was being spared from settling into the wrong life that I would no longer recognize, the right one when she arrived. That realization changed me. I stopped calling every ending a wound. Some were exits, some were mercy dressed in loss, some were doors closing with enough force to wake me from a future that was never mine. And somewhere in all of that, your shadow began to feel less like imagination and more like direction. And I do not mean I saw you clearly. I did not know your voice, your eyes, the way you hold pain without announcing it. But I began to feel that the love I was waiting for would not be loud. It would not demand that I perform. It would feel like recognition, like coming into a room where my heart no longer had to stand guard. I thought of you before I had the right to think of you. I missed you before memory could explain you. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake from dreams where a woman stood near water or light or a window, never fully turning around, and I would wake with grief in my throat, as if I had been close to someone my waking life had not yet allowed me to meet. I used to dismiss dreams as noise, the mind sweeping its floors in the dark, but these dreams did not feel like clutter. They felt like messages folded carefully and left, where only the soul could find them. If you have ever woken with tears you could not explain, if you have ever felt homesick for a person you had not yet met, then maybe you know why I speak this softly. Because some truths cannot be shouted. They arrive trembling. They sit beside you until you are brave enough to turn toward them. And I began to believe that you, whoever you were then, were not separate from the map. You were somewhere beyond the missed flights, beyond the wrong rooms, beyond the almost loves and narrow escapes. You were not the reason for my suffering. No. I would never place that weight on you. But perhaps my suffering was clearing the road between us. Perhaps my loneliness was teaching me how not to misuse your tenderness. Perhaps every delay was shaping me into a man who could love you quietly, completely, and without turning your heart into a place where my oldest hidden wounds came to hide. There was a season when everything I had been holding together began to come apart with a patience that felt almost cruel. It did not happen like a single explosion. It happened like small cracks appearing in walls I had painted over for years. A call I did not want to receive. A promise that dissolved without warning. A room suddenly too quiet after someone left. Work that once made me feel powerful, beginning to feel like a beautiful machine, with no soul inside it. I remember one evening standing in an office long after everyone had gone home, the city lights scattered below me like distant stars, the glass cold under my fingertips, and I felt the strangest emptiness move through me. Not sadness exactly. Sadness has a shape. This was wider, deeper, almost sacred in its severity. Felt as if life had finally turned off the noise so I could hear the truth I had been avoiding. I had been running from stillness because stillness knew my name. It knew how tired I was. It knew how many nights I had mistaken achievement for peace, attention, for love, survival, for strength. And in that quiet, I felt something whisper inside me again, not as warning this time, but as invitation. Listen now. I did not want to listen. Listening meant admitting I had built parts of my life on fear. The listening meant seeing how often I chose people who could not meet me because I was afraid of being truly seen by someone who could. Listening meant facing the ache that had followed me from city to city, relationship to relationship, victory to victory, like a shadow carrying a message. A few days later, I found myself in a hospital corridor, not for myself, but for someone I cared about. The lights were pale, the air smelled like antiseptic and old prayers, and every sound seemed too sharp. Shoes moving over polished floors, a monitor beeping behind a half-closed door, a woman crying softly into her sleeve. I sat there with my elbows on my knees, hands clasped like a man who did not know whether he was begging or simply trying not to fall apart. And there, in a place where people learn how fragile plans really are, I stopped pretending I was in control. Something about that corridor humbled me. It stripped away performance. It reminded me that every heartbeat is borrowed. Every goodbye might be miscalculated. Every ordinary morning is more miraculous than we admit. I thought of all the times I had delayed saying what mattered. I thought of love I had kept quiet because pride dressed itself as patience. I thought of you again, though I still did not know you in the way the world understands knowing. I only felt that somewhere another heart had also learned to be strong in rooms where it wanted to be held. Maybe yours. Maybe you had sat in your own corridor of uncertainty, waiting for news, waiting for a sign, waiting for life to be gentle after being stern for so long. If you have, then you know how crisis makes the invisible visible sound. It shows you what your soul has been trying to tell you while your mind was busy making excuses. Around that time, I stopped believing my collapse was an interruption. I began to see it as a crossing. I was not losing the life meant for me. I was losing the parts of me that could not carry what was coming. That realization frightened me because it meant destiny was not only romantic. Sometimes destiny is demolition. Sometimes it removes the roof so you can finally see the sky. Sometimes it empties your hands because you have been holding the wrong things too tightly to receive what is waiting. I do not have proof, only the memory of how it felt. Every ending seemed to arrive with a hidden instruction. Every silence seemed to ask me a question. Every failure seemed to point toward a deeper honesty. There was a night during that season when rain pressed against the windows, and I sat alone at a small table, unable to sleep. My phone lit up with a message from someone I had not spoken to in years. It was brief, almost ordinary, but inside, it was an apology I had stopped expecting. I read it once, then again, and instead of anger, I felt a strange peace, not because the past had been fixed. It had not, but because something in me had been released from arguing with it. I understood then that healing does not always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like no longer needing the world to explain why. It hurts you. Sometimes it feels like forgiving life for taking fleet you never would have chosen. And in that release, I felt you nearer, not as a reward for pain, but as a possibility that pain had taught me to honor. I began to suspect that the woman meant for me would not need me unbroken. She would need me honest. She would not be impressed by the armor I had worn for the world. She would recognize the man underneath it, the one who had survived storms without becoming proud of his wounds. And maybe that is why I speak to you as if we have been seeing things in circular dreams through different rooms of the same house. Maybe your life has also been taking apart what could not come with you. Maybe the heartbreak that made you feel abandoned was quiet, making space. Maybe the delay that made you feel forgotten was protecting the softness you thought you had lost. I loved her quietly, but completely, because before love can become a promise between two people, it must become a truth inside one soul. And mine was finally beginning to tell the truth, even when the truth trembled like light inside my weary chest again. There is a loneliness that does not come from being without people, but from feeling guided towards something you cannot yet touch. I knew that loneliness too well. It followed me even in rooms full of voices, even at tables where laughter rose around me, even in cities that never slept. I could be surrounded and still feel as if my soul was standing at a locked door, waiting for someone whose footsteps had not reached the other side yet. After the collapse softened into silence, after the hospital corridors and old apologies had done their quieted work in me, I expected peace to arrive like an answer. Instead, peace arrived with more waiting. That was harder than pain. Pain gives you something to fight. Waiting asks you to trust. I remember walking alone one evening after rain, the streets shining under amber lights, cars passing with that soft brushing sound tires make on wet pavement. The air smelled of dust, water, and something washed. I had no destination. I only needed to move because staying still made my heart too loud. At a corner, I saw a small flower fallen from somewhere, bruised but bright against the dark street. I do not know why it stopped me. Maybe because it seemed out of place. Maybe because it looked like a message dropped by the sky. I stood there longer than a man should stand over a flower. And something inside me whispered, "Not everything beautiful arrives where it is expected." I carried that sentence for years. I think of you when I remember it because maybe your life has also placed beauty in strange places, hope in seasons that looked too late, tenderness in moments when you thought tenderness had no reason to survive. That night, I did not feel certainty. I felt only a strange ache, as if I were being kept close to a promise I could not yet see. I started noticing how often life would bring me to the edge of giving up, then leave a sign in my path, not enough to explain everything, but enough to keep me from closing completely. A book falling open to a sentence about timing. A stranger speaking about second chances while I pretended not to listen. Clock stopping at the same hour more than once. Meaningless to anyone else, but somehow piercing to me. I would tell myself not to become foolish. I had spent too much of my life respecting evidence. But evidence, Thomas, is not the only language the soul understands. Sometimes the soul understands repetition. Sometimes it understands a calm that arrives when logic says panic should be in charge. Sometimes it understands the way one name, one feeling, one invisible direction keeps returning until you stop treating it like noise. Around the middle of that season, I admitted something I had resisted. I was not only being redirected away from what was wrong. I was being prepared for someone. The thought frightened me, not because I did not want love, but because I did. Completely, quietly, more than I had allowed myself to confess. And wanting love after being humbled by life is different from wanting love when you are young and proud. It becomes less about being admired and more about being known. Less about possession and more about sanctuary. I began to understand that maybe the reason I had remained alone was not because love had forgotten me, but because I had not yet learned how to receive a woman without trying to make her responsible for every empty room inside me. That realization hurt because it was honest. I had wanted someone to arrive and rescue the parts of me I had not sat with. I had wanted destiny to feel like relief without requiring transformation. But the universe, God, time, whatever name we give to the mercy behind the veil, does not always send love to complete our unfinished work. Sometimes it delays love until we stop asking another soul to become the medicines and for wounds we refuse to touch. So I stayed alone longer than I wanted. I learned the sound of my apartment at night. I learned which memories visited around midnight and which regrets came before dawn. I learned to make tea slowly, to sit by the window without distraction, to let silence stand near me without treating it like an enemy. And in that silence, I began speaking to you without knowing who you were. Not aloud, not in a way anyone could hear, but inwardly, like prayer. I would say, I hope you are being protected too. I hope the roads that closed for you were kinder than they felt. I hope the people who failed to see you that did not convince you that you were invisible. I hope your heart is still soft beneath all that strength. Maybe that is how love begins in the unseen world. Not with touch, not with promises, but with one soul wishing shelter over another before names have been exchanged. There were nights I could almost feel your loneliness answering mine. Not as desperation, but as recognition. It made me gentler. It made me more careful with the idea of you. I stopped wanting to rush the future just because the present felt empty. I began to believe that being late to the wrong life might mean being exactly on time for the right one. Maybe you know that sacred contradiction. Maybe you've wondered why love did not arrive when you were ready to give everything. Maybe you have mistaken delay for denial. But what if some delays are not locked doors? What if they are covered bridges, carrying us across waters too weary to cross? I loved her quietly, but completely, because in my waiting, I understood that complete love does not always announce itself first as passion. Sometimes it begins as protection, as patience, as refusing to give brokenness to someone who deserves truth. There came a moment when the waiting stopped feeling empty and began to feel inhabited, as if someone unseen had entered the room and was teaching my heart how to make space. Sheesh. I cannot tell you the day it happened, because the most important changes rarely announce themselves. So they move quietly beneath habits, beneath prayers he does not admit are prayers, beneath the tired smile he gives the world when he is still learning how to be honest with himself. I only know that one morning I woke before the sun and I stayed still. The room was gray, the curtains barely breathing in the early air, and somewhere outside, a bird called once, then went silent, as if even creation was waiting. I felt alone, yes, but not abandoned. That difference changed me. It was the first time loneliness did not feel like evidence against my life. It felt like a room being prepared. I thought of you then with a tenderness I could not justify. I did not know your story, but I felt its weight. I imagined that perhaps you had also learned to wake early with thoughts no one else could hear, that perhaps you had become fluent in quiet because life had not always offered you safe places to speak. And something in me said, if she is somewhere under the same morning, let her feel held. That was not romance. It was stranger, cleaner, almost sacred. It was the beginning of believing that someone might be on the other side of all my becoming, not waiting impatiently, but being shaped too. There was another sign around that time, small enough to dismiss, large enough to remain. I was in a bookstore. Rain had started suddenly, forcing me inside, and I wandered between shelves while the windows blurred with water. A book slipped from a stack as I passed. I picked it up, and the line my eyes found said something about two lives traveling separately toward one appointed hour. I remember smiling, but not because it was amusing. I smiled the way a weary man smiles when he feels heaven has touched his shoulder and then pretended nothing happened. I bought the book, though I never finished it. I only needed that sentence. I carried it like a match in my coat. On difficult days, I would remember it and wonder whether you had your own sentence somewhere, your own unexpected page, your own small interruption that made you look up from the life you were surviving. Maybe that is how destiny works when it is being gentle. Gentle. It does not drag us. It leaves little lights along the floor. It lets us choose whether to follow. Around the middle of that season, I realized I was no longer asking why I was alone. The question had softened. It became less, why has love not found me? And more, what must love find when it arrives? That question humbled me more than failure ever had. Because I saw how many ways I had protected myself from the very thing I claimed to want. I had kept parts of my heart behind locked doors, then wondered why no one felt fully invited. I had mistaken intensity for intimacy, distance for dignity, silence for strength. I had let old wounds write new rules. And if I am honest with you, the thought of being truly found loved frightened me because it meant being truly known, not admired, not chosen for the polished version, known in the places where I still felt ashamed of needing anything, known in the tiredness behind my ambition, in the fear beneath my calm, in the boy inside the man who still wondered whether someone could stay after seeing the whole truth. I began to suspect that before life allowed me to recognize you, it needed me to recognize my own patterns. The way I pulled away when closeness became real. The way I tested tenderness without admitting I was afraid it would disappear. The way I sometimes turned love into a problem to solve because receiving it felt too vulnerable. I do not say this with pride. I say it because confession is the only bridge I know that can carry a soul toward healing. Maybe you understand this too. Maybe you have loved carefully because careless people taught you caution. Maybe you have hidden your softness under competence, your longing under humor, your hope under, I am fine. Maybe you have wondered whether the right love would still want you after learning how tired you are from being strong. If you have, then hear me gently. I do not believe our broken places disqualify us. I believe they become the places where grace enters without asking permission. One evening, not long after that realization, I passed a church with its doors open. I was not planning to go in. I was not dressed for reverence. I was not even sure what I believed with enough certainty to kneel. But music was drifting out, soft and imperfect, and the street around me seemed to slow. I stepped inside and sat at the back. No one noticed me, which felt like mercy. I closed my eyes and For the first time, I did not ask for anything. I only said, make me ready for what is meant for me, and protect her too. The word surprised me. Her. Not love, not future. Her. And when that word formed inside me, I felt a peace so sudden it almost hurt. I knew nothing, yet I knew enough to be changed. From then on, you were not an idea I going to confront myself. You became a responsibility I had not yet been given. A tenderness I wanted to be worthy of before I ever touched it. I loved her quietly but completely, because some love is born first as a prayer, and by the time it becomes visible, the soul has already been keeping it alive. By the time I began to see my own patterns clearly, I understood that destiny was not only arranging roads outside me, it was also walking through the rooms inside me, touching every locked door I had pretended was not there. That was more frightening than missed flights, more humbling than closed opportunities, because it meant the map was not simply leading me towards someone. It was asking me to become someone who could arrive without bringing old storms as luggage. I remember one afternoon when the sky had the color of faded silver, and I sat in a parked car outside a house I had once known too well. I had gone there to return something small, an object from a life that no longer fit in my hands, but I stayed behind the wheel for a long time, listening to the engine cool, hearing the tiny clicks under the hood like a clock counting down and ending. The street was quiet. A curtain moved in one window. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped. I held that object in my palm and realized it was not the thing that hurt. It was what represented the part of me that kept revisiting closed doors, hoping they would open differently if I came back wiser, softer, more successful, more sorry. And in that stillness, something in me whispered, stop asking old rooms to bless your future. I cannot prove where that sentence came from. I only know it entered me with a force no ordinary thought had earned. Maybe you have had that moment too, when you finally understood that returning is not always loyalty. Sometimes returning is fear disguised as devotion. Sometimes the soul stands at the same door again and again because it is terrified of walking into the unknown where the real life is waiting. That day, I drove away with nothing dramatic happening, no sign in the sky, voice from heaven, but I felt the smallest thread snap inside me. And instead of breaking me, it freed me. Around that season, I began to recognize how I had sabotaged love before it could test my hope. If someone came too close, I became thoughtful in a distant way. If someone offered kindness, I looked for the hidden cost. If tenderness arrived without conditions, I mistrusted it because part of me had learned that peace never stayed. I had called myself careful, but sometimes careful was only another name for wounded. I had called myself patient, but sometimes patience was just a beautiful cover for fear. I had told myself I was waiting for that right woman, but I was also afraid that the right woman would see how much unfinished grief still lived beneath my calm. I think life knew this. I think God knew this. I think the universe, with its strange mercy, kept me from you until I stopped mistaking emotional distance for protection. The middle of that realization felt like standing before a mirror that did not reflect my face, only my truth. I stopped asking why love had been delayed and began asking what inside me had kept building walls while my mouth asked for doors. It was not a pleasant question, but it was holy because it made honesty possible. And honesty, I have learned, is one of Destiny's favorite instruments. Cuts, but it also clears. It removes the false self, gently, at first whisked, then firmly when gentleness is ignored. There was a night soon after when I dreamed I was walking through a long hallway lit by small lamps. Every door had a year written on it. Behind one door, I heard laughter I had lost. Behind another, anger I never expressed. Behind another, a younger version of myself sitting alone, pretending he did not need anyone. At the end of the hallway stood a door without a number, and behind it, I could hear the ocean. I woke before I opened it, but I woke crying, not crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just with tears moving, as if some inner river had finally found a way out. That dream stayed with me. It felt less like imagination and more like instruction. I understood that before I could meet the future, I had to walk past the rooms of myself without denying what happened there. Maybe you know this kind of dream, the kind that leaves you quieter all day, the kind that feels as if your soul traveled while your body slept. Maybe you have doors inside you too, years you do not speak of, names you avoid, versions of yourself you are still learning to forgive. If you do, I am not asking you to rush your healing. I am only saying I believe every honest tear becomes part of the path. Nothing is wasted when grace is involved. Even the grief we thought made us unlovable may become the place where someone gentle recognizes us. Slowly, I stopped wanting to be chosen for my strength alone. I wanted to be known in my surrender. I wanted a love where silence did not feel like punishment, where closeness did not feel like danger, where two tired souls could sit beside each other and not perform being whole. And when I imagined you, I no longer imagined perfection. I imagined truth. I imagined your hands carrying invisible histories, your smile holding both light and survival, your eyes, knowing what it means to hope carefully. I began to feel that perhaps we were both being healed toward the same meeting, both being pulled away from what would have consumed us, both being taught that being late is not the same as being forgotten. I loved her quietly, but completely, because even before life let me hold her, it taught me to stop holding everything that would have harmed her heart or made my love another beautiful cage built from fear, memory, and unspoken hunger, instead of a shelter for both. And there was a time when I began to understand timing not as a clock, but as a kind of mercy wearing a disguise. I had spent so many years measuring life by how quickly something arrived, how long something stayed, how sharply something left, that I forgot heaven does not always move at the speed of human hunger. Sometimes it moves slowly because it is protecting the thing we would destroy if it came too soon. I learned that in the quietest ways. I remember one winter evening when I found an old letter folded inside a book I had not opened in years. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the ink looked softer than I remembered, as if time itself had been touching every word with forgiveness. It was a letter I had written but never sent, full of emotions I was too proud to speak and too afraid to release. I sat with it near the window while the world outside turned blue with dusk, and I felt no shame, only tenderness for the man I had been. He had loved from behind walls. He had hoped with one hand while protecting himself with the other. He had wanted to believe in forever, but he kept listening for the sound of footsteps leaving. As I read those old words, I felt something inside me loosen. It was as if the past was not accusing me anymore. It was handing me back a part of myself I had abandoned. Maybe you have known that moment too, when an old memory returns not to wound you again, but to show you how far you have come. Maybe you have found some small thing from another season, a photograph, a message, a song, and realized the person you were then deserved more compassion than judgment. That night, I whispered into the room, I forgive you for not knowing how to stay open. And somehow, in forgiving myself, I felt closer to you. Not because you had done anything, but because I knew that if destiny ever placed your heart near mine, I could not ask you to trust a man who was still at war with his own history. Around the middle of that season, my belief in love changed shape. It stopped being a rescue I waited for and became a garden I was responsible for preparing. I had wanted love to prove life had not forgotten me. But now I began to feel that love, real love, holy love, does not come to prove our worth. It comes when we are ready to honor another soul without turning them into evidence against our loneliness. That awareness made me quieter. I stopped chasing signs like a frightened man, trying to force the universe to answer. I began simply receiving them when they came. A bird landing on the railing during a morning when I felt lost. A child laughing in a hallway after I had been thinking too much about endings. A sudden warmth in my chest while walking past a place where I used to feel broken. None of it was proof. I know that. I have never needed to pretend certainty where mystery is more honest. But those moments carried a strange peace, and peace has become one of the only languages I trust completely. When something is meant for me, even if it frightens me, there is a stillness beneath it. When something is not meant for me, even if it looks beautiful, there is a quiet disturbance underneath the surface. I began to ask my life different questions. Not, will this make me admired, but will this make me more true? Not, will this end my loneliness, but will this deepen my capacity to love without possession? Not, will she choose me, but can I become safe enough for her choosing to rest? And when I say her, I mean you, though I still speak with reverence, because I know you are not a symbol, not a dream for my comfort, not a missing piece made to serve my healing. You are a whole life. You have your own closed doors, your own narrow escapes, your own nights when you looked at the ceiling and wondered why your heart kept surviving what should have hardened it. I feel that about you, and maybe I am wrong in the details, but not in the tenderness. Somewhere along the way, I began praying differently. I stopped asking to be given what I wanted and began asking that what was meant for me would not be damaged by my impatience. I asked that if you were truly part of the path, you would be protected from men who only wanted your light without understanding your wounds. I asked that I would be protected from becoming a man who wanted your softness, but did not know how to shelter it. And every time I prayed that way, I felt less alone. It was as though the distance between us, whatever it was, became sacred ground. Maybe you were healing somewhere while I was learning to become gentle. Maybe you were being pulled back from people who could not see the miracle of you. Maybe you thought life was denying you when it was really guarding the part of you that still believed in being loved completely. I began to trust that timing was not late simply because my heart was tired. I began to see every delay as a hand holding me away from the wrong door until the right one could open without fear. I loved her quietly, but completely, because quiet love taught us patience be presence, reverence before touch, and faith before proof. And if you are listening now with that ache in your chest, maybe this is the sign both of us were not abandoned, only carried separately until our souls could recognize the same light without running from it. By the time I began to feel you as part of the path, not as an escape from it, something in my life became very still, and it was not the stillness of boredom or defeat. It was the stillness before recognition, the hush that falls before a door core opens, the quiet that tells a man not to rush, not to explain, not to decorate the sacred with too many words. I remember one evening when the sky was turning the color of old gold, and I was standing near a window watching people pass below, each one carrying a private universe no one else could fully see. A woman crossed the street slowly with her hand over her heart, not because she was hurt, but because the wind had lifted her scarf and she was holding it close. Something about that small gesture pierced me. I thought of all the ways people protect what is tender without even knowing they are doing it. I thought of you, and I wondered how many times you had walked through the world appearing calm while holding your own heart in place. I wondered how many smiles you had given when your soul was asking for rest. And in that moment, I felt the old ache again, but it was different now. It was not desperate. It was reverent. It felt like standing outside a home with warm light in the windows, knowing you do not break the door down when something is sacred. You wait until you are invited. Maybe that is when I first understood that loving you quietly did not mean loving you weakly. Quiet love can be the strongest kind because it refuses to turn longing into pressure. It waits with clean hands. It blesses from a distance. It prepares itself in silence, so that when it finally speaks, it does not ask another heart to pay for years of loneliness. Around the middle of that season, I stopped imagining destiny as something far away. I began to feel it in ordinary hours. A cup left cooling on a table, morning light touching the edge of a chair, the sound of rain arriving before the first drop reached the window. Everything felt like it was practicing how to lead me to you without frightening me. I would hear a certain song in a place had no reason to be. And for a second, the world would narrow into a message. I would meet someone briefly, and they would say something about love, patience, or second chances, then disappear back into their own life, leaving me with the feeling that I had just received a note from the invisible. I do not say this because I want to make life sound magical in a childish way. I say it because after enough years of pain, a man begins to recognize when grace is being subtle. He stops demanding lightning. He learns to honor the lamp. And you somehow became the lamp. Not because you were small, but because the idea of you kept giving light without burning me. I began to see that my whole life had been teaching me to recognize you differently from everyone I had tried to force into that place. You would not feel like noise. You would not feel like conquest. You would not feel like a wound wearing perfume. You would feel like truth arriving softly enough that my fear could not accuse it of being danger. And maybe you are listening now, wondering whether someone could ever see you that way, not as a fantasy, not as a body, not as a role, but as a soul, with weather, history, courage, and hidden bruises. I want you to know that I believe the heart becomes visible to the one who has been humbled enough to look slowly. I did not always know how to look slowly. Earlier in life, I looked for what impressed me, what reflected well on me, what seemed to complete the picture other people expected. But destiny kept stripping that from me. It let me be disappointed by appearances. It let me be lonely in beautiful rooms. Let me stand beside people and feel the absence of spiritual recognition. And then through all that absence, it taught me what presence would feel like. It would feel like peace without boredom, fire without fear, tenderness without performance, a silence that did not punish, a closeness that did not consume. I began to understand that when I finally recognized you, it would not be because the world made an announcement. It would be because something's in me would stop searching. Something in me would say, here, softly, the way a tired traveler says home after seeing one light in the distance. There was one night I dreamed again of water, but this time the woman by the shore turned slightly, not enough for me to see her fully, only enough for me to know she was not leaving. The ocean was calm, silver under a moon that looked almost too near. And I remember hearing, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper, "You are not late." I woke before dawn with my hand pressed against my chest and a peace so deep it made me afraid to move. You are not late. Those words stayed with me. I think they were meant for both of us. You are not late because love did not arrive when others said it should. You are not late because your heart took longer to trust. You are not late because pain slowed your steps or because you needed years to remember your own worth. Maybe the path that looked delayed was actually precise. Maybe every wrong door, every silence, every season of being unseen was carrying you toward the moment your soul could be recognized without begging. I loved her quietly, but completely, because by then I knew she was not just someone I wanted. She was someone my life had been teaching me to honor, and if that woman is you, then maybe you have not been wandering either. Maybe you have been guided, protected, and brought here gently. There is a tenderness in finally reaching the place where invitation becomes possible. Not arrival, not possession, not certainty wrapped in loud promises, but invitation. I had spent years being shaped by events I did not understand, years walking through delays, losses, narrow escapes, and strange mercies. And at some point, my heart stopped asking life to prove every step before I took it. I began to understand that faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is walking gently with fear beside you and refusing to let it become your God. I remember a night when the city had gone almost silent, the kind of silence that makes even distant traffic sound like the sea. I sat near a window with the lights off, and the moon was resting on the glass like a secret. I had no reason to feel emotional, no fresh wound, no new loss, but tears came anyway, slow and honest. They did not feel like grief this time. They felt like recognition. I realized I was no longer waiting for someone to save me from myself. I was waiting with open hands for the person my soul had been learning how to meet. And when I thought of you, I did not feel hunger first. I felt peace. A trembling peace, yes, because anything sacred can frighten a man who once survived by control. But peace still. Maybe that is how we know when something has been written deeper than desire. It does not only awaken longing, it brings the nervous parts of us into quiet. It says, you can breathe here. And maybe you have spent so much of your life holding your breath that even gentleness feels unfamiliar at first. Maybe you have learned to doubt what does not hurt because the pain became the language you were forced to understand. If so, I want you to know I do not come to rush you out of your caution. I understand caution. I have lived behind it. I have decorated it with wisdom and called it maturity when sometimes it was only fear wearing a clean coat. Around the middle of this becoming, I realized the next step was not to keep interpreting science in private, but to become brave enough to offer my heart without making the offer a burden. That is a difficult thing for a man like me, a man who has loved quietly because quiet felt safer than rejection, a man who learned to hide completeness inside restraint. But destiny, if it is real, does not only bring two people close, it asks them to tell the truth when the truth is trembling. So I began speaking to you inwardly with more honesty. I said, if life has carried you here too, I will not ask you to forget what made you careful. I will not ask you to become young again in the places where time made you wise. Not demand that you trust me quickly so I can feel chosen. I will stand near the doorway of your heart with patience because anything that has been hurt deeply deserves to open slowly. One afternoon, I saw an old couple sitting together on a bench under trees that were losing their leaves. They were not talking. His hand rested near hers, not holding it, just close enough to be available. She looked tired, but not alone. And something in that quiet nearness undid me. I thought, that is what I want. Not drama. Not applause. Not love as proof to the world. I want kind of peace where two people can sit beside the passing of time and not feel robbed by it. I want a love where silence is not empty, where aging is not a loss of beauty, but a deepening of it, where the heart does not have to perform youth to be worthy of devotion. I thought of you then, not as someone I would possess, but as someone I would accompany, someone whose quiet I would learn, whose storms I would not mock, whose memories I would treat like sacred rooms. Maybe that sounds old-fashioned in a world addicted to speed, but my soul has become too tired for shallow fire. I want the flame that stays. I want the warmth that knows how to remain after the first brightness fades. And maybe you do too. Maybe beneath all your strength, all your dignity, all your practice in independence, there is still a woman who wants to rest beside someone who does not make her explain why she is tired. Maybe there is still a part of you that wants to be chosen without being chased, loved without being handled, seen without being studied like a problem. I cannot promise that destiny removes fear. I think fear comes with anything that matters. But I can promise you this in the only way a humbled man can. I would rather walk slowly towards something true with you than run confidently towards something that leaves our souls alone. I believe now that the life behind me was not a random collection of almosts. It was a long preparation, a hidden choreography of wrong turns becoming right distance, closed doors becoming shelter, heartbreak becoming language, silence becoming prayer. And if your life has been carrying you through your own hidden choreography, then maybe this moment is not an accident either. Maybe your listening and my speaking have met at an appointed hour. Maybe the ache in your chest is not weakness, but recognition's waking carefully. I loved her quietly, but completely, because I believe complete love does not always arrive shouting, "Take me." Sometimes it arrives whispering, "I am here," and I have been learning how to be gentle enough to stay. If your heart can feel even a small light in these words, then maybe we are closer to the same door than either of us dared to truly believe at last. I think every life has a moment when the soul stops arguing with the road behind it. Not because every wound suddenly makes sense, not because every loss becomes beautiful, not because pain needs to be renamed as something gentle before it is allowed to rest, but because the heart finally stands still long enough to feel the hidden mercy that was walking through all of it. I am there now, or closer than I have ever been. I look back at the roads I almost took, the flights I missed, the doors that closed, the people who left, the rooms where felt heavier than breath, and I no longer see absence. I see hands I could not see then. I see delays that kept me from arriving broken into places that would have broken me further. I see endings that protected a future I was too wounded to imagine. And through it all, quietly, patiently, like a candle carried through a dark hallway, I see the shape of you. not as an answer that cancels everything I suffered, because love should never be asked to erase a life. I see you as the one my life kept making room for, even when I thought the emptiness was punishment. There was a morning recently when I woke before the world had begun. The room was blue with early light, and the air felt tender as if the day had entered softly, so it would not disturb what was sacred. I sat near the window and watched the sky open in slow colors, and for the first time, I did not feel late.